Thank everybody.
Wait a sec. Let's just get the recording going, okay? So, all right, yes, thank you everybody for coming. I'm Linda from the Upper Saddle River Library. We're very excited to be teaming up with the Wyckoff Library as well. We're going to present tonight's program, The Sun Will Darken, presented by Joe Rayo. He's the chief meteorologist and science editor at News 12 Westchester. Was as well as an associate and guest lecturer at the Hayden Planetarium. As I said before, this program is being recorded. We do ask that you mute yourselves. Both Michael from the Wyckoff Library and myself will be monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will get that through. And with that, I am now going to mute myself as well. Thank you, Joe, and I will let you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and very pleasant good evening to all of you. This is a very exciting time for me, and it will, I hope, be an exciting time for all of you because we have this wonderful celestial event. In fact, it really is a bucket list event if you happen to be in the right spot to view it, and we'll get into that in just a very few moments. I'm going to start my presentation on our first slide. I want to thank again the Upper Saddle River Public Library and the Wyckoff Public Library for inviting me to give this presentation this evening, as we are now just 1 week away from E-Day, the day of the eclipse of the sun. Now, this particular presentation is going to deal with the specifics about the eclipse, and among other things, we're going to talk about the fact that it is kind of like a dance of three, or if you're in French, a pas de trois. We are one of the three dancers, we here on the planet Earth, but we also have in the sky our moon, which dominates our sky at night. The moon, hundreds and thousands of years ago, was thought to be a goddess in the sky, a goddess by the name of Celeste. And the most important of the trio, and the reason why we're all here, is the most important object in the solar system, which is, of course, the sun. 864,000 miles across is the part that we see normally. It's all gas from its surface to its center, gas clear into its entirely hot central regions, 11,000 degrees on the surface, almost 30 million degrees at its center. Gas, nonetheless, all the way through. Gas that, well, if you were able to take a small amount of it, a cubic centimeter of this, it would be heavier than the weight of a similar amount of water. The sun, compressed, hot, spewing out all forms of radiations out into space. Were it not for the sun, you wouldn't be here, I wouldn't be here, nobody on this planet Earth, no any form of life would be here. So the sun is very, very important. We thought that the sun was carried across the sky by a god by the name of Apollo. Apollo, which took the sun supposedly on a chariot trip out of the eastern part of the sky at sunrise, and then at midday it would be high, high in the southern sky, and then the sun would drop down toward the west. And that was our thoughts about both the sun and the moon. The sun was the god Apollo, and the moon was the goddess Selene. Now, if anything happened to either Selene or Apollo, if anything were to happen to the moon or especially the sun, woe would be man. We thought that the sun would sometimes, or the moon would sometimes be attacked by some invisible monster which would try to devour or eat it. The Chinese, in particular, had this thought that the sun was being devoured from time to time by a dragon. And that dragon, upon chomping away at the sun, the ancients, Chinese, the people who lived in the Far East, would try to do their best to chase the dragon away. I now am going to tell you the story of the earliest known eclipse, the earliest recorded eclipse of the sun. And it's an interesting story, and I find it most appropriate because if you remember about a month or so ago, we were entering the Chinese New Year, and this year, again, rather appropriate, is the year of the dragon. So let's talk about that very first recorded solar eclipse. The day was bright. The great sun hung motionless in the sky above the Yangtze Valley. The Chinese storytellers record what happened next. The dragon, Lung, restless with hunger, appeared, and before the eyes of the frightened people, Lung began to devour the sun. The day grew darker. The people raised a din, a chant, prayers. The dragon was startled. He desisted. The sun slipped from his jaws, and Lung vanished to await another chance. Our computers give us the date. It was October 22nd in the year 2137 BC. Now, the rarity of what happened on that day and what is to happen 1 week from today over North America is explained by the fact that the moon does not orbit the Earth in the same plane as the Earth orbits the sun. If it did, the moon's shadow would pass across the Earth every month. Instead, the moon's orbit is tilted a little bit. So when the high side of its orbit is tilted toward the sun, the moon's shadow passes above the Earth. Later in the year, when the Earth is revolved to a position on the other side of the sun, the low side of the moon's orbit is toward the sun, and the moon's shadow passes below the Earth. But when the Earth is midway between those two positions, the orbit of the moon can bring it into line between the sun and the Earth, and the result is what we're going to see happen 1 week from today, the shadow of the moon passing across the Earth. Now, just as a bookmark to that eclipse of 2137 BC is the fact that there were two Chinese court astronomers. On the left there's Hai, and on the right was Ho. And Hai and Ho's job was to watch the sky constantly during the day and night, and if anything unusual appeared in the sky, a broom star, what we would call a comet, or perhaps a guest star, what we know as a nova, or a meteor shower, or a strange configuration of two or more planets in the sky, and especially eclipses of the sun and moon. It was their job to alert the Emperor of China, to tell the Emperor so that the Emperor could tell everyone, in the case of an eclipse, to bang on the drums, to chant, to shoot rockets up into the sky to chase away Lung from devouring the sun. Well, on this occasion, the eclipse of 2137 BC, for reasons we'll never know, Hai and Ho decided to have a little party. They imbibed a little bit too much, they had too much to drink, and they ended up getting a little bit drunk, if you will, or inebriated, a nice way of putting it. And as a result of that, they fell asleep. They were asleep all during the night, and they fell asleep all through the course of the following day when the eclipse took place. And after the eclipse had taken place, the emperor was furious because no one had told him, nobody had alerted anyone about the eclipse. Where were his two court astronomers? And he had them brought to him. And he said, "You two have sinned a great sin. We almost lost the sun today to the great dragon Lung because of you. You were supposed to tell us. And now you must pay the ultimate price." And the ultimate price? Well, you can see by the gentleman holding this rather large knife. Remember in Crocodile Dundee when he said, "No, mate, that's not a knife. This is a knife." Well, I can already assure you what the knife was used for when they tied Hai and Ho to a stake, and they literally and figuratively, but literally, they lost their heads. That was the price they had to pay, the punishment they had to pay for being lax at their duties and not informing anybody about the eclipse that was taking place. But this is not an isolated incident. All over the world, in various cultures, whenever an eclipse of the sun and moon occurred, there were people who chanted, prayed, did everything they could to chase away the invisible monster that was devouring the sun. Here you see these two guys here, one guy with a spear. I guess he figured, I'll toss the spear up toward the sun and maybe that'll chase the monster away. In other cultures too, they had thoughts about what it might be. Some thought it was a pig or a goat. I know that in one particular culture, they thought that lunar eclipse, an eclipse of the moon was being devoured by a gigantic invisible frog in the sky. So you see, there are all different explanations as to what an eclipse was all about. Here's one that a limerick that is written by an anonymous person. "Sometimes I think of the sun and the moon as lovers who rarely meet, always chase, and almost always miss one another. But once in a while, they do catch up and they kiss, and the world stares in awe of their eclipse. My supposition of this limerick was that what was going on up there during an eclipse was that Selene and Apollo were getting together, so to speak, and having a nice little smooch during the eclipse. And meanwhile, we here on Earth, we mere mortals with our instruments, our telescopes, our binoculars, our tripods, and everything, just staring up and watching this unusual interaction between the god of the sky and during the day and the goddess of night. Well, we learned over time that eclipses are not occurring haphazardly. We're not getting, out of left field, all of a sudden there's an eclipse. With every eclipse that occurred since the High and Ho incident in 2137, we kept records of eclipses. Here you see a record of a solar eclipse that was carved on a Babylonian tablet back around 630 BC. Over time, over decades, centuries, millennia, we built up records of eclipses, and eventually we discovered something. We discovered that there was a very specific cycle going on which allowed us to predict when an eclipse was going to take place. Here is the very first eclipse computer, we think. This was Stonehenge, still standing in Salisbury, England. Stonehenge was built not in one but 6 stages between the years 3000 and 1500 BC during the transition from the Neolithic period to the Bronze Age. And here's what it may have looked like brand new around 1500 BC. Now, the British astronomer Gerald Hawkins wrote 2 articles for the reputable journal Nature in 1963 and 1964, in which he pointed out several new Stonehenge alignments to the sun and moon, and he proposed that the Aubrey holes, can you see that there are holes around the perimeter of the monument here, and there are more holes over here? What were they for? Hawkins said they were used to help predict eclipses. He proposed that the 56 holes, they again were called Aubrey holes, could be used as markers to predict eclipses. And he wrote a very popular book right after his 2 articles in Nature were published, a popular book called Stonehenge Decoded, in which he said that Stonehenge gave the world the idea that the monument was a Neolithic computer, again, specifically used for the prediction of eclipses of the sun and eclipses of the moon. And if you had the ability of being able to decipher these cycles of the sun, the moon, the planets, and were able to predict where the sun and moon were going to be at any given moment in time, or let's say you had the ear of the emperor or the king or queen of your local part of the world, you could whisper in the king's ear and say, "Hey, king, you know what's going to happen a week from today? The dragon is going to try to eat the sun. There's going to be an eclipse." And of course, anyone who had that ability of making such predictions was a very, very powerful person, a soothsayer, a necromancer, or an astrologer. And it amazes me today that even in this 21st century, that many newspapers, many tabloid newspapers, have a section in their paper every day that gives horoscopes, predictions. People actually read these and actually follow them along, thinking that there is something to it. Well, I would hope that that was not be the case today, but hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, when we didn't know anything really about the planets, the movement of the planets, the moon, the sun, people who had that ability of being able to make such predictions were, again, very, very important persons. And here is one of those cycles to help predict eclipses. The cycle was called the Saros cycle and is derived from the Greek repetition. Now, if you ever watch TV, September or October, you might watch your favorite television program, brand new to you, you've never seen it before, but then when you get to June or July, the same program is rerun. Summer reruns. The program is recurring again on your TV screen. Well, with eclipses, believe it or not, we have reruns. An eclipse will take place at a specific time, a specific date, and believe it or not, that eclipse will recur a number of years later. In this particular case, the eclipse recurrence will be every 18 years, 10 and a third, or 11 and a third days. If in an 18-year cycle there are 5 leap years that take place, well, then it's 11 days. If there are only 4 leap years in that 18-year cycle, then it's 10 days. And again, a little over 18 years, an eclipse will recur, will take place once again. I'll give you a demonstration of the Saros cycle. Now, here is a map that shows you a solar eclipse. This was an eclipse that took place on July 20th in the year 1963. You see the date up in the upper right-hand corner. What you're seeing is a map showing the zone of visibility of an eclipse of the sun. This area that you see here, this unusual shape, shadow area, that is the shape of the penumbra shadow. The penumbra is where you can see at least a partial eclipse of the sun. In fact, for example, you see this blue line here? Along that blue line, on this day, July 20th, 1963, everybody along or near that blue line would see 25% of the sun covered. No big deal. It passed across Los Angeles on that day. Then here's the 50% line. That line moved across the United States, and well, you see right here, Miami. If you were in Miami on July 20th, 1963, you would have seen a 50% eclipse. And this line is the 75% line, where you'd see 75% of the sun eclipsed by the passing moon. And these two blue lines closely packed together, this is the path of totality. This is the zone where if you were along this track, you would have seen a total eclipse of the sun that would have lasted 1 minute and 40 seconds. That would have been a pretty nice thing to see if you happen to live, well, let's see. At sunrise, the eclipse track began over Hokkaido in northern Japan. Then it crossed the northern Pacific Ocean, then moved over southern Alaska, down across Canada, and then moved out across the state of Maine before moving out over the Atlantic Ocean, ending at local sunset over the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. It took about 3 hours or so for the shadow to move from all the way over here to all the way over here. And again, this is the zone where the eclipse would have been total. Now, if the Saros cycle, the repetition cycle, is correct, the cycle that was determined by the ancients, by the Babylonians, at least 2,000 years ago, from all of those records that were kept of previous eclipses, if this Saros cycle is correct, then in 18 years, well, let's see, we add 18 to 1963, what do we get? 1981. And in that 18 years, 5 leap years took place. So now we're talking about 11 days. So 18 years and 11 days from 1963, July 20th, we're talking about July 31st in the year 1981. And in that year, on that date, July 31st, the path of the shadow of the moon across the Earth's surface would be pretty much the same as it was in 1963. The circumstances would be just about the same. Well, if we move forward in time, 18 years and 11 days, boom, look at that. The shadow pretty much is the same kind of track for totality here. And here are the lines, the 25 and the 50 and the 75% line, and the same general region of where the shadow, the outer shadow, the penumbra, but there is something different. There is something different. Have you noticed? In 1963, the shadows were passing mostly over North America. But this isn't North America. And the shadow didn't start over Japan. This time the total eclipse shadow started over the Middle East and then crossed over into Mongolia and then through Siberia, for goodness sake, and then out to the north of Japan and then ending out in the Pacific Ocean to the north of the Hawaiian Islands. What happened? Why is it taking place over a completely different part of the world? It's taking place over a different part of the world because remember what I said about the Saros cycle. 18 years, 11 and 1/3 of a day. 1/3 of a day. So when the shadows return to touch the surface of the Earth 18 years later, the Earth, in its turning on its axis, rotating around on its axis, turned 120 degrees, 1/3 of a way around, 8 hours. And so as a result, here's North America up here. And the fact that the Earth is now turned one third of the way on its axis means that the shadow is going to pass over a completely different part of the world. In this case, over Asia, not North America. So that is the Saros cycle. Again, 18 years, 10 or 11 and a third days. And that one third of a day makes a big difference because, again, when the shadow comes back, the Earth will have turned around one third of a way around on its axis. Here's another interesting cycle, the exiglimos, or the triple Saros. Now, the triple Saros is 3 Saros cycles. So multiply 18 by 3, and what do you get? You get 54. 54 years. And if you multiply 10 or 11 days by 3, you come up with approximately 32 days, plus or minus a day. So after 3 Saros cycles, 54 years and just a little over a month, we indeed have the turning of the wheel, so to speak. The shadows will return to the exact part of the globe that it occurred 54 years earlier. Now, I'm not going to ask you to remember the word exiglimos. I'm not even going to ask you to remember triple Saros, but I will ask you to remember a number. There's the number that you should remember, 54, because what is to occur next week has a very a big say in this particular number, 54. I'll explain and I'll demonstrate to you a little bit later on in the talk. Oh my goodness, what the heck is this? This is a piece of junk. But no, it's not a piece of junk. It is a very special device. This is the Antikythera mechanism. It is an ancient Greek hand-powered model of the solar system described as the oldest known example of an analog computer. Would you believe this is a computer? It is a computer. And it was used to predict astronomical positions and eclipses decades in advance. It was found among wreckage among the shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901. So it was underwater for seemingly a long time, which is why it looks the way it does. And its construction apparently relied on theories of astronomy and mathematics developed by Greek astronomers. We estimate that this was built sometime around the year 200 BC. So, assuming that the shipwreck occurred around 200 BC, this thing was underwater for over 2,000 years. No wonder it looks the way it does. And then in 2008, a team from a British university used computer X-ray tomography and high-resolution scanning to image inside fragments of this crust-encased mechanism. And they read, or were able to read, faint inscriptions that covered the outer casing. This suggests that it had 37 meshing bronze gears to calculate the positions of the 5 classical planets, follow the irregular orbit of the moon, the movement of the sun through the zodiac, as well as to predict eclipses. In fact, those scientists in 2008 built a replica of what they felt the Antikythera mechanism must have looked like when it was brand new in 200 BC. Here you see the cranks, here you see the inside of the machine, the meshing gears, and the inscriptions which indicated the positions of the sun, moon, and planets. Crank those gears and you'd be able to tell where any of the planets were, where the sun was, where the moon was, and also you would be able to make a prediction about eclipses that may happen in the future. Oh, what an amazing device this was. You know, we talk about people who lived 2,000 years ago who were living in the dark ages. Well, let me tell you something. Tomorrow, if you have a chance, walking on the main street of your neighborhood, stop anybody on the street for a moment and say, "Excuse me, sir. Excuse me, madam. Could I ask you a question?" Every month we see the moon, and it goes through phases. We see a crescent moon, we see a half moon, a three-quarter illuminated moon. Sometimes we see a full moon. And my question to you is, why does it do that? How does it do that? Can you explain that to me? I'm sure that if you ask 9 out of 10 people, they probably would say, "Oh, well, yeah, I learned that in science class when I was in 8th grade or whatever." You know, how does that? Is it the moon going around the Earth, or is it the Earth going around the sun? And then finally they'll probably give up and just say, "I don't know. I don't know," and they'll give you a little chuckle at that. Well, it's nothing to be laughing about. This is, after all, the 21st century. We supposedly live in the space age. We should have some sort of knowledge about the sun, moon, and planets. All of us should, to a certain degree. And yet, the people who lived in the so called Dark Ages, 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, look what they were able to do. They were able to make computers. They were able to predict the motions of the sun, moon, and planets. They were able to predict, for goodness sake, future eclipses. How could they have done that? They were awful smart people. That's all I can say. And the fact is that in our history books, we have found eclipses that indeed were very, very much in the historical vein. For example, what probably is the most famous eclipse of ancient times, the most famous eclipse of the sun in ancient times, ended a 5-year war between the Lydians and the Medes. These two Middle Eastern armies were locked in a fierce battle when suddenly the day was turned into night, and the sight of this total solar eclipse, which we now know occurred on May 28, 585 BC, was startling enough to cause both nations to cease hostilities at once, and they agreed to a peace treaty and cemented the bond with a double marriage. It's too bad we can't have that today. Can you imagine having a total eclipse of the sun, let's say, over the Ukraine and stopping that terrible war which has been going on unendingly for the last 2 years? Can't happen today in the modern, sophisticated, civilized world of the 21st century. But in 585 BC, a total eclipse actually stopped a war. And the most famous lunar eclipse involved this gentleman, which all of you, I'm sure, learned about in elementary or grammar school. He sailed the ocean blue in 1492, and it was indeed Christopher Columbus. In fact, Columbus didn't make just one journey to the New World, he made three. But it was the third voyage that he made in 1503 where he almost met his end. In 1503, Columbus found himself stranded on the island of Jamaica. His ships were damaged and beyond repair. Now, at first, he and his crew were able to get food and water from the natives on Jamaica. And in order to get food and water, they exchanged little baubles, trinkets, the little tchotchkes. You see here one of the Jamaican natives looking intrigued by a bell. Oh my goodness. It makes a sound. It looks like a ringing sound. What is that? Can we have it? And Columbus obviously would say something like, oh, certainly you can have the bell. But in exchange for the bell, could you get us food? Can you bring us some water? Oh, of course. And so that's how it pretty much went for a while. Columbus figured he was going to be rescued by a caravel from Europe. It would take maybe a few weeks. So during the few weeks that he was on Jamaica, he would trade off these little baubles and tchotchkes with the natives, and they would bring food and water and supplies to him and his crew. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks stretched out into months, the Jamaicans finally refused to supply any more food or water. And now, not only did he have that problem, Columbus's own crew were getting tired. They say, well, yeah, you said we were going to be rescued, many weeks, many months ago. It's been like months. When are we going to get rescued? Going to get off this island? And now Columbus's own crew ready to turn against him. So faced with the prospect of both starvation and mutiny, the great Italian admiral conceived of a most ingenious plan. Consulting his navigational tables, which every good sailor would have, uh, Columbus made a discovery that there was going to be a total eclipse of the moon that would commence right after the moon rose on the final night of February in 1504. So he arranged a meeting with the natives just prior to sunset that evening and just prior to moonrise and the start of the eclipse. And he announced to one and all that because he didn't like the way they were treating him and his crew, that the Almighty had decided to permanently remove the moon as a sign of his displeasure. Now, Columbus timed his theatrics precisely. No sooner had he proclaimed the moon's disappearance than the moon appeared above the eastern horizon with a bite taken out from it. And soon the bite got larger and larger and larger. And the natives, as you could well imagine, became terrified. And as the moon gradually diminished, they pleaded with Columbus to restore it. Please, please bring the moon back. They promised that he'd be provided with all the food, all the supply, all the water that he wanted, that he and his crew wanted, if only he would bring back the moon. And when the moon became totally eclipsed, Columbus told them that he would have to retire to his quarters and try his level best to convince his Almighty God to bring back the moon. He actually said to them, he said, you know, you guys, you were very nice to us when we first arrived here on your island, and you did bring us food and water and everything else. You're a bunch of good guys. I tell you what, I'm going to ask my Almighty God to pardon you. That I'm going to ask him to bring the moon back. Now, I can't make any promises, but I'm going to do my level best. I'm on your side. Believe me when I'm on your side. So he went back into his quarters to speak with his God. Want to know what his God was? You ever see the movie The Wizard of Oz? Remember that part in the movie where this appeared, the hourglass of the Wicked Witch, and she told Dorothy, "My pretty, that's how long you've got to live." Well, in Columbus's case, he used his simple hourglass. He used it to time out the duration of the total eclipse of the moon. And when he was aware that the moon was about ready to reemerge from total eclipse, a few minutes just prior to the end of the total phase, he stepped back outside and announced that his God had pardoned the Jamaican natives, and he would allow the moon to return to its place in the sky. And would you believe? Sure enough, it did. And you would well imagine Columbus had no more problems with the Jamaicans, who gratefully supplied Columbus and his men with all the food and supplies they wanted and needed until a rescue caravel arrived from Europe to take them all home. A very famous story in history that was read by many, including this gentleman, who you know either as Samuel Clemens or his pen name, Mark Twain. Mark Twain, of course, wrote many stories about Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and Becky Thatcher, but he also wrote a very famous eclipse story. Mark Twain wrote in 1889 a book, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. And the book, believe it or not, was made into one of the very first talking pictures way back in the year 1931. And the legendary humorist Will Rogers, you remember Will Rogers, made famous by what he once said, "I never met a man I didn't like." Well, Will Rogers was the star of this movie. He played the part of a 20th century Yankee who has been sent back in time to the days of King Arthur. Now, he's about to be burned at the stake by King Arthur as an evil sorcerer, but he has one last hope. Looking at a little black book he carries, he discovers that there's going to be a total eclipse of the sun at high noon. So he now faces King Arthur and threatens him with something about what he's going to do to the sun.
Hey, King, you better turn us loose right away. Because if you don't, I'm sure going to put the old Yankee curse on you. All right, King, you asked for it. Now you're going to get it. Prosperity, farm relief, freedom for Ireland, and light wines and beer.
Magician, mightiest of wizards, we humbly beseech thy mercy. Name thy terms, even to the half my kingdom, but restore the sun to thee.
All right, Artie. You know, you're not a bad feller at heart. And I'll see what I can do for you, you know, but I'll do the best I can. Coolidge, Hoover, Rockney, and Earl Smith.
Ye have witnessed the mightiest of miracles. All homage to him who hath brought back the sun.
Oh, yes. Hip, hip, hooray. Will Rogers brought back the sun. And then he had no problems with King Arthur after that. Just like Columbus had no problems with the natives on Jamaica after he brought back the moon. But this whole science about eclipses all deals with shadows. I have a little shadow that goes in and out with me. And what could be the use of him is more than I can see. That's what Robert Louis Stevenson wrote. But you know what? Sometimes you can have an eclipse of the sun that was totally and completely unpredicted, unforeseen, and can happen in the most unusual place. Take, for example, several years ago during a postseason baseball playoff game in San Francisco. San Francisco Giants going up against the Washington Nationals. Watch what happens and listen to the play-by-play announcers when this unusual eclipse of the sun took place.
Be a big pitch for Madison.
And with a strange shadow being cast mid-pitch as a result of a blimp or a plane flying overhead. It's 2 balls and a strike to LaRoche. Even Adam had to look up and say, what is going on here?
That would be the blimp. The lights went out. No clouds. Beautiful sunny day.
It's hard enough to hit Madison Bumgarner.
Well, there you go. The shadow of a blimp on the playing field. And I guess you can see the right fielder there getting ready to enter the shadow for a second or two. And I like what the baseball commentator said. The lights went out. Yeah, for about a second or two, but it didn't last very long. It was a very localized thing. Well, now I'm going to show you another picture which looks somewhat similar to this one, but has a completely different set of circumstances. This picture was taken from 250 miles above the surface of the Earth. Looking down on the surface of the Earth, you see that black blotch there, or that dark blotch? That's not the shadow of a blimp. That's the shadow of the moon. And this was passing over Europe. It was August of 1999. This view was taken from the now defunct Mir Russian space station. And indeed, whoever was in that shadow for not just a couple of seconds, but a couple of minutes, the lights truly did go out because the sun was obscured by the passing moon. And we're going to talk about solar eclipses in a moment. First, let's talk about eclipses of the moon. Now, with an eclipse of the moon, I hope you're aware that the moon does not shine on its own. It's shining by reflected sunlight. So when the sun shines on the moon, we see it. But if we were to take the sunlight away from the moon, well, obviously, it should get dark, right? Should it disappear completely? The Earth has a shadow that runs approximately 1,000,000 miles or so out into space. Every now and then, the moon will venture into the shadow like it did for Columbus in 1504. And since the shadow at the distance of the moon is a 250,000 miles away from the Earth, is approximately 5,000 miles across, and the moon is a little over 2,000 miles across, the moon has no problem in getting completely immersed at times in the shadow of the Earth. And yet, when the moon is completely in the shadow of the Earth, does it disappear? No, it doesn't. Because during the total phase of the eclipse, the moon seems to glow with a kind of a coppery, reddish, or orange light. Well, what in the world is that being caused by? It's being caused by us, our atmosphere. Fortunately, we live on a planet that has an atmosphere that allows us to breathe. And when the sun is high, high in the sky during the middle of the day, you know, or at least I hope you know, that sunlight is composed of all the colors of the spectrum. If you take a special piece of glass called a prism, you can break the sunlight into the colors of the rainbow. When the sun is high in the sky, the sunlight takes a short length of time to get to your eyes. Short wavelengths are tilted toward the blue end of the spectrum, and since there are tiny little dust particles in the atmosphere, that those rays bounce off the dust particles, scatter the light, and so we see the sky during the daytime looking a bluish color. But when the sun is low to the horizon, either when it's first coming up in the east in the morning or going down in the west in the evening, the light rays take a much longer path to get to your eyes, a longer wavelength of light, which is tilted more toward the yellows, orange, and reddish colors. And that's why when the sun goes down or when it's coming up in the morning, the sky near the horizon, right along the rim of the horizon, turns a ruddy color, an orange color. Now, when we're looking at an eclipse of the moon from here on the Earth, what's happening on the moon? Well, if we were on the moon looking up during an eclipse of the moon, we would be seeing an eclipse of the sun, for goodness sake. And the Earth being 4 times bigger than the moon, the Earth would thoroughly cover the sun completely. You would expect that on the moon, everything would go dark, but it doesn't, because the atmosphere of the Earth is being backlit by the sun. And so as a result, we're seeing, well, it looks like a thin reddish ring of light right around the rim of the moon, right around the rim of the Earth. Remember the colors you see at sunrise and sunset? Well, that's what's happening during a total eclipse. The light, the red light that you see during sunrise and sunset, is being bent or refracted into the shadow of the Earth. And so when the moon goes into the shadow, the only source of light now is that red light that is being directed toward it onto the surface of the moon. And so the moon, during totality, suddenly lights up with a reddish color. It's lighting up with that red or coppery color from all the sunrises and all the sunsets that are occurring at that moment of totality. And in fact, here you see a view of a total eclipse of the moon. Notice the shadow looks quite dark, quite black, as the moon is entering the shadow, but then just when all of it is in the shadow of the Earth, the moon lights up with a reddish or coppery glow. And then after totality is over, the moon will exit the shadow and revert back, the shadow does, to that blackish color, and the moon will once again regain its normal guise, approximately 3 or 4 hours after the eclipse first began. You'll be able to see this next year from right here in the tri-state area, because on March 14th, make a note of it, March 14th, 2025, we will be treated to a total eclipse of the moon. Oh, how wonderful. So if you're out and about, and if we have clear weather that night, you'll be able to see it. And not just us, everybody who is facing the moon, the dark side of the Earth, wherever the moon happens to be above the horizon when the eclipse is taking place, will be able to partake in the total eclipse. That's much different than a total eclipse of the sun. With a total eclipse of the sun, you have to be somewhere along a narrow track that could run 8,000 or 9,000 miles in length and might be maybe 100 miles wide. But unless you happen to be right along that track, you're not going to see a total eclipse of the sun. You'll see just a partial. But with the eclipse of the moon, everybody on the dark side of the Earth, the nighttime side of the Earth, facing the moon during the eclipse, gets a chance to see it. And that means not only North America next year on March 14th, but South America as well. We're talking about a potential viewing audience of over 1 billion people that will be able to enjoy the view of a totally eclipsed moon next year on March 14th, 2025. All right, let's get into the eclipse of the sun. You probably have noticed that the sun and the moon in our sky look pretty much the same size, and you must say to yourself, how is that possible? You know that the moon is much, much smaller than the sun. The Earth is much, much smaller than the sun. In fact, the sun is, compared to the moon, 400 times the moon's diameter. So how is it possible that something that small, 865,000 miles for the sun and only about 2,100 miles for the moon, how is it possible, you say, that the moon looks the same size as the sun from here on the Earth? Well, the reason is that the sun is 93 million miles away, but the moon is 250,000 miles away. It's 400 times closer to us as opposed to the sun. And there is the compensation. Sure, the sun is much bigger, but the moon is much closer. And because of that, the moon and the sun in our sky appear to be the same size. Not actually the same size exactly, because the moon goes around the Earth in an ellipse or an oval-shaped orbit. It takes 28 days for the moon to make one trip around the Earth. And at one point in its orbit, the moon is at what we call perigee, 221,000 miles away, closest point to the Earth. And then 2 weeks later, it's on the other side of its orbit, and that's the far side of its orbit. We call that apogee, 253,000 miles away. So there's a 32,000 mile difference between when the moon is near and when the moon is far. And that's a difference of approximately 12 or 13%. The Earth-Moon distance varies, and as a result, In the sky, the size of the moon also appears to vary by about 12 or 13%. Here are two pictures of a full moon. The moon on the left the picture was taken when the moon was near the far point, apogee. On the right, the moon was full at the near point, perigee. And in fact, the mainstream media has a word for this now, or a branding for this. They call a close full moon a supermoon. The supermoon. Well, I don't know. Does it look all that super? Again, it's only about 12 or 13% bigger than when it's far from the Earth and appears that much smaller. But in any case, the moon changes size in accordance with its trek around the Earth in its orbit. And that's important when it comes to eclipses of the sun. Let's say, for example, that the moon happens to be passing directly between the sun, which is off the image here to the left. The sun is out here, shining on one side of the moon, and the moon casts two shadows into space. The penumbra, that's where you have the partial eclipse visible, and the umbra. The umbra is the dark shadow cone from where you would see a total eclipse of the sun. Now notice here, the shadow cone tapers off, tapers to a point, but the point doesn't touch the Earth. Here is that point on the Earth directly underneath that umbral shadow out in the Atlantic Ocean. So what would you see if you were at that red dot in the ocean looking up? You would see this. You would see the moon covering the sun in silhouette, but when it's perfectly lined up with the sun, a ring of light, a ring of sunlight shines around the disk of the moon, because the moon in this particular case was at apogee, about 250,000 miles away. So it was too far for the shadow, the dark shadow of the moon, the umbra, to reach the Earth's surface. And so, when it is properly lined up, you have the moon and a ring of sunlight shining around the disk, the dark disk of the moon. And we had just such an eclipse 6 months ago. In October of 2023, the path of that eclipse, approximately 130 miles wide, trekking across the Pacific Ocean and then coming inland across Oregon and Nevada and Utah and New Mexico and Texas. Anybody who was located within this band that you see here, well, you would see a ring of fire in the sky. You would see an annular or ring, not an annual, it doesn't happen every year, an annular eclipse, which is Latin for ring-shaped. And I call this type of an eclipse, by the way, a penny on nickel eclipse. Dig into your pocket and look for a penny and a nickel and put them on the table. I challenge you to cover the nickel with the penny. Impossible. You can't do it. Why? Because the penny is too small to cover the nickel. Pretend the penny is the moon. Pretend the nickel is the sun. And now you get the idea. During an annular or ring of fire eclipse, the moon is just a little too far away from us to cover the sun completely, and so we get that ring of sunlight in the sky. I got to tell you something. All the people who lived outside of that zone of the ring eclipse, they got in their car, and you could see eclipse traffic on Saturday, October 14th last year. There were indeed major delays for people trying to get into that zone of the eclipse. Now, I might tell you, if you travel into New York, all of these electronic signs today, and I saw this over Easter weekend, are already flashing. Eclipse of the sun, Monday, April the 8th. Arrive early, stay late. In other words, get to wherever you want to go to see the eclipse early enough so that you avoid running into heavy traffic jams, and especially so after the eclipse. Stick around for a day or so, if you can, to allow the traffic conditions to alleviate themselves so you don't run into so many people trying to get from point A to point B for this spectacular event, an eclipse of the sun. There you see the ring in the sky. This is what everybody was waiting to see last October. It's an interesting sight, but compared to a total eclipse, it's like literally night and day. The ring that's remaining around the dark moon is still bright enough to make it seem somewhat like daytime. It's going to get a little dimmer during an annular or ring eclipse, a little bit dimmer, kind of like a cloudy, hazy day. But again, it is nothing compared to a total eclipse of the sun. Here is what is going to happen next Monday. The moon, unlike last October, when it was 250,000 miles from the Earth, this time the moon is going to be about 25,000 miles closer to the Earth, 225,000 miles away. And as a result, that dark shadow cone is going to make it all the way to the surface of the Earth. And if you happen to be underneath that dark shadow cone or along the trek that it takes across the Earth's surface, if you're anywhere in the path of the dark shadow, you will see a total eclipse of the sun. And you know what? Some of you may remember this. Those of you of a certain age, I will say, it was a Saturday afternoon in 1970, March the 7th, 1970, when there was a total eclipse of the sun, the path of which went right up along the eastern seaboard of the United States. And here in New York, we didn't get a total, but we had an almost close call with that. 96% of the sun was covered on that special day in March of 1970. You see the New York Times saying, millions watch eclipse in clear sky and eerie twilight fell briefly over the New York metropolitan area. The approaching eclipse cast deepening shadows on the skyscrapers and darkness into the streets below. Well, wait a minute. Hold on for a second. Let's see. That was March 7th, 1970. Do you remember earlier in this talk I mentioned one specific eclipse cycle? What was that cycle? That was the exoglemos, the triple Saros, the turning of the wheel. I said that after 3 Saros cycles, after 18 years multiplied 3 times, what was the number I asked you to remember? 54. Yes, 54 years and a little over a month later, the same type of eclipse would recur over the same part of the world. So what does that mean? That means that if the exoglemos works, it means that the eclipse of 1970, the one that almost created a total eclipse of the sun in the New York metropolitan area, is going to return. It's going to come back. Well, let's see. Add 54 years to 1970. That's 2024. That's 2024. That's this year. And 32 days plus or minus a day. Well, it comes out to be 32 days. Add 32 to March the 7th. You know what date you're going to come up with? April the 8th. April 8th, 2024, we should see a recurrence of the eclipse that, well, everybody was gawking at in the sky back in 1970. Take a look. In 1970, the path of the total eclipse went across the Pacific Ocean. It came on shore in Mexico, just to the west of the Yucatan Peninsula, crossed the Gulf of Mexico and moved up northern Florida and along the eastern seaboard. Here's where we are, the tri-state area. We missed a total eclipse by about 75 miles. Ooh, too close, and yet so far. Any case, if the exoglemos is right, we add 54 to 1970, that's 2024. Add 32 to March 7th, that's April the 8th. And if we look ahead, look what we have. We have a very similar eclipse to 1970. Once again, the dark shadow of the moon will touch the Pacific Ocean, roll north and eastward, hit Mexico. This time, though, a little bit more to the north and west. So instead of occurring just aside of the Yucatan Peninsula, now it doesn't even cross the Gulf of Mexico. This time it will move right in from Mexico into Texas and then up into the Tennessee River Valley, the Ohio River Valley, the eastern Great Lakes, upstate New York, northern New England, and then pass out to sea out in the middle part of the Atlantic Ocean. It's basically the same eclipse that we were treated to in 1970. We had 96% of the sun covered in New York City in 1970. This time, not quite as much, but still a rather significant amount. Here is an animation to show you what's going to happen 1 week from this Monday. Actually, now it's less than a week because the eclipse is going to be at like 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Monday next. Did you see the penumbral shadow, the outer shadow of the moon, 5,000 or so miles wide? At one point, that penumbra is going to cover virtually all of North America. Everybody in the penumbra will see at least a partial eclipse, but you know where you want to be? You want to be along the zone of the total or deep shadow of the moon, the umbra. There it is, going across Mexico, Texas, and continuing north and east up across New York State, upstate New York, and New England. Now take a look at this animation. You can see the actual track, the actual path that the dark shadow is going to take. And here, a clock showing the duration of totality. You know, in most total eclipses of the sun, totality lasts 1, maybe 2 minutes or so. Look at this. Look at this. In Mexico, it's going to last, totality will, 4 minutes and 27 seconds. And then it'll diminish some, but still lasting more than 3 minutes, even when it gets up into New England. My goodness, this is going to be some total eclipse of the sun. An excellent total eclipse of the sun. And it's not in New Jersey, but New York, our adjacent state, the Empire State, they're making a real big deal out of this. This will be the first time that the path of a total eclipse of the sun is going to cross through a part of New York State in 99 years, not since 1925. And Governor Hochul in New York and the I Love New York Committee is making a big, big deal out of this. They're trying to get adjacent states like your state in New Jersey. They're saying, come for the eclipse. And while you're coming for the eclipse, why not stay a little while for New York? Here are a number of cities that are going to involve or be involved in the total phase of the eclipse. Here's the path of the eclipse, which is going to be about 110 miles wide, running from this dark line, that's the northern limit of totality, to the yellow line, which is the southern limit of totality. And look at some of the big cities that are going to be involved in the total eclipse. Cleveland, Ohio, Buffalo, New York, Niagara Falls, Rochester, New York, Syracuse, New York, Watertown, New York, further north, Burlington, Vermont, which is on the other side of Lake Champlain and up into New England. And in fact, across the border, Montreal, the second largest city in Canada, will be seeing a total eclipse of the sun. And where are we? We're all the way down here in the tri-state New York metropolitan area. So from here, we're going to get just a partial eclipse. But now, you say, all right, I'll stay here and watch the partial. 91% of the sun will be covered at maximum at 3:25 next Monday afternoon. And you say, well, that's good enough for me, Joe. No, it really isn't. You see, to see a partial eclipse of the sun is like, and I was using this analogy before the presentation began, seeing a partial eclipse is like going to the Super Bowl, except you don't have a ticket. So you drive into the parking lot and spend your good money to park your car, and you maybe engage with others in the parking lot having a tailgate party. Oh, this is fun. But then all of a sudden it's time for the game to start, and everybody in the parking lot says, okay, let's go and see the game, and they have tickets. You don't. So you're left all by yourself in that parking lot with your car. Meanwhile, everybody else is inside the stadium enjoying the game, enjoying, the hot dog man coming along to bring you food. You're able to see the scoreboard, all the excitement, all the great part of the whole experience of the Super Bowl is inside that stadium. And that is kind of like seeing a total eclipse of the sun. You're inside. You're seeing the main show. Seeing a partial eclipse, you're outside. You're stuck in the parking lot. You gave it a good try. You're rather close, but no, you're not seeing any part of that game unless you maybe listen to it on your radio or whatever like that. So that's what being in New York is like compared to being, let's say, in Syracuse or Rochester or Buffalo. They are seeing the Super Bowl. You're in the parking lot. You'll see some of it, almost all of it, but not quite all of it. And this is basically what you're going to see. 3:25 next Monday afternoon, you get the crescent image of the sun in the sky. Very interesting, and it might get a little dark. Somebody was asking me today, so what kind of darkness will we see in the tri-state area with that much of the sun covered? He's expecting me to say, oh, it's going to get really dark. No, here's what it's going to get like. You get a flashlight. Put, some brand new alkaline batteries in the flashlight, right? Brand new. Flick on the light and aim it at somebody. It's blindingly bright almost. No, oh my goodness. Oh, you know how the light shines like a brilliant silvery white light, right? Now, take those batteries out and put batteries in that have been already more than half used up. What's going to happen when you flick that light on? When you flick that light on, the light is going to come on more slowly. And yes, there'll be enough light to give you light if you're in a dark room, but it almost looks yellowish or tawny in color. And it will look It look kind of strange, it's not that brilliant bright light you have with brand new batteries. That's what it's going to be like next week in the tri-state area. You step outside, the sun might be shining brightly, we hope, and yet you look around and say, what's wrong? There's something wrong here. I mean, I see the sun, but the sun doesn't look like it's shining at full force. It looks like it's kind of dim. It almost looks like it's kind of weak in brightness. That's because, again, 91%, but it's, again, not dark enough for you to see the wonders of a total eclipse when the sun is completely covered by the disk of the moon. And that's why I've been telling people, get in your car when you consider that scientists, astronomers, astrophysicists will travel halfway around the world to see a total eclipse of the sun, to stand in the shadow of the moon for 3 or 4 minutes, and yet here you are. You are only by car maybe 3, 4, 5 hours away from the band of totality. Look how close you are. And if you say, well, I'll wait until it's close the next time it's we get an eclipse this close to New York will be on May 1st, 2079, 55 years from now. Don't intend to be here. I think many of you aren't going to be here either. So why wait? I mean, unless you want to travel to the next total eclipse after this one, that's going to be in Greenland and Iceland, August of 2026. Do you see what I'm talking about? You have a chance to see the greatest spectacle that your eyes have ever rested eyes on coming up a week from now, or you could stay and watch this, the partial eclipse of the sun. It is the total eclipse that absolutely is so phenomenal. The moon first appears to move slowly between us and the sun. At first, there appears to be just a small bite taken out of one side of the sun. Then the bite grows larger and larger. The sky begins to dim. You begin to understand why these moments were so terrifying to early man. Now the time approaches when only a blinding crescent edge of the sun, like we'll see in New York, is visible. Then the sun shines only through the craters and mountains on the moon. And then the cosmic vision of a lifetime, a total eclipse of the sun. Only the outer atmosphere of the sun is visible now. The incredible corona flashes out into the heavens. Even the stodgiest of astronomers who have experienced this moment of total eclipse speak of it in awe. On that next Monday in April, tens of millions of Americans will get a chance to see it for themselves. But then after about 4 minutes or so, the cosmic sequence reverses itself. The sun flashes back into our line of sights. The total eclipse is over, and unless you plan to do some long-distance traveling, most of you will probably get another chance to see another one again. So by all means, take advantage of it. Here's what happens. You ever see in the sky stars twinkling? Why do they twinkle? They're twinkling because as their light interacts with the Earth's atmosphere with moving pockets of cold and warm air, the light from the stars seems to scintillate or twinkle. Does the sun twinkle? No, it's a big disk in the sky. But when we cut that disk down to a narrow hairline in the sky, a narrow filament, then the atmosphere, the turbulent atmosphere takes over. And if you look on the ground or if you look on a house nearby, you will see shadow bands, or some people call them shadow snakes, wavering, rippling across the ground real fast, a function of the Earth's atmosphere working on that narrow bit of sunlight that remains just before total eclipse and then just after the total eclipse. And then you see the beautiful diamond ring, the light, the remaining light of the sun shining through mountains and valleys on the moon, creating a beautiful ring of light, the innermost corona just beginning to appear as the last little bit of the sun is disappearing behind the disk of the moon, and it creates basically a diamond ring in the sky. Now, in 1925, the last time we saw a total eclipse in New York, the path of the total eclipse crossed through New York, cut New York City in half. The upper part of Manhattan and the Bronx and the lower Hudson Valley and northeastern New Jersey in the zone of totality, well, all those folks got a chance to see the great spectacle of a total eclipse of the sun. But if you were in Midtown Manhattan, Lower Manhattan, or Brooklyn, for example, you wouldn't have seen a total eclipse. You would have seen this. You would have seen the last little bit of the sun shining triumphantly out from behind the mountain and valley of the moon, and you would have seen the inner corona, and it looked in the sky for 20 or 30 seconds like an engagement ring or a diamond ring. And the people who were in Midtown Manhattan and Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn, outside of the eclipse track, they said, why didn't anybody tell us about this? You kept telling us to go into the zone of totality, but we saw an amazing sight from right here, just outside of the shadow. It was amazing. And so the New York, they got all kinds of people calling up the New York Times and saying, why didn't you tell us about this in all the newspapers the day before about what we were going to see if we didn't get into the totality? And the New York Times said scientists missed out on Sun's diamond ring. They had to get an astronomer, Henry Norris Russell, to explain what they saw with that last little bit of sunlight remaining and with the innermost corona being visible. And in fact, in that article, it said this was spontaneously called the diamond ring by members of people in New York. And this term, hitherto unknown to astronomy, was apparently fixed forever as a technical term in the literature of the subject by Saturday night. The eclipse was on a Saturday back in 1925. A beautiful and perfect description of the effects, said Dr. Russell. And to this very day, when we talk about the last little bit of sunlight disappearing before totality, or the first little bit of sunlight reappearing after totality, we call that the diamond ring, and that term got started right here in little old New York. Look at how dark it gets. It gets about as dark as it does 40 minutes after sunset or 40 minutes before sunrise. That is how dark it gets. You're not going to get that in New York. No siree. And you're not going to see the amazing colors, saffron and orange and yellow and red all around the horizon during the total phase of the eclipse. And it's changing constantly because the shadow is moving at 2,000 or more miles per hour over you. There you see the corona high in the sky. And when it gets that dark, 40 minutes after sunset or 40 minutes before sunrise or similar darkness, guess what? You get to see stars and the brighter planets. Coming out next week at totality, you'll see Venus to the lower right of the sun and Jupiter all the way up to the upper left of the sun during totality. Oh, you ever see stars and planets at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon? Not from New York, but you'll be able to see it in Buffalo or Watertown or Syracuse or Niagara Falls if you go to see totality. And the crown of the sun. That's the thing that makes an eclipse special. Always around the sun, but during totality is the only time that you'll see it. When you block out 100% of the sun with the moon, boom, out comes the corona, that ionized outer atmosphere of the sun, streaming outward, ragged at the edge, streaks running through it. Oh, what a beautiful sight to see. Now comes the liability part of my talk. Don't do what this guy's doing. If you have a telescope, do not look directly at the sun during the partial stages of the. Don't look at the sun at all during any time. You know, people actually think it's the reason why it's dangerous to look at the sun is because of the eclipse. They think the sun is emitting some kind of a strange ray that, oh, you don't want to be out there when the sun is in eclipse. No, the sun is dangerous all the time. I took a phone call once on behalf of the Hayden Planetarium a number of years ago. Somebody was calling up. There was going to be an eclipse of the sun the next day. And the guy on the phone, he said, hey, excuse me, could you tell me when the eclipse is going to end? And I said, okay, let me just look it up here. And I looked it up on the information sheet I had. I said, the eclipse will come to an end tomorrow at 2:54 p.m. And the guy said, well, let me write that down, 2:54. That's when the end of the eclipse is going to be, right? I said, yes, sir. He said, okay, good. So I can look at the sun later after that, right? No, you don't look at the sun after the eclipse is over. Again, it's the sun that is dangerous. You should not look at the sun directly with your bare eyes or with binoculars. Now, if you have a telescope, here's what you do. You point the telescope at the sun. Don't look through the eyepiece, of course, but you point the telescope at the sun and project the image through the telescope onto a white screen made of paper or cardboard. For example, here's a guy, he used his telescope, he's projecting the image onto a white screen, and not only that, there are people all around him that are able to enjoy this enlarged image of the sun. You might even be able to see a few sunspots on the sun next Monday if you use this methodology. Or if you don't have a telescope, if you have binoculars, mount the binoculars on a tripod, like this young lady is doing. And you can see, here's the beginning of the eclipse down here, a little bite, and you have not one but two images for the price of one. So that's one way of looking at the eclipse. Another way, kids love to do this. They make a cardboard projection box. They allow the sun to shine through a hole that was made in one side of the box. You put a piece of aluminum foil over the hole, punch a hole, pinhole through that, and let the sun shine through the pinhole onto the opposite side of the box, and you get a small image of the partially eclipsed sun. And you see, the kids love it. And if they don't have a box, you can do what this kid is doing. You'd use two pieces of cardboard representing either side of the box. A little hole that's punched in one end lets the sunlight shine through it onto the second cardboard or paper, and you get a chance to see the eclipse that way. Or you can look down on a tree. Now, unfortunately, I was looking around today. There aren't too many trees. I think there's forsythia bushes. I don't know if it would work with forsythia, but the trees, you really need the leaves. And when you have a lot of leaves on the trees, the spaces in between the leaves act as pinholes. They shine through the pinhole, the sun does, and they shine down below the tree. And dozens, scores, hundreds of images of the eclipse taking place up in the sky is now visible below the tree on the ground. If you don't have a tree, do you have a cracker? I mean, like if you have a saltine or a Ritz cracker and they have holes in them, let the sun shine through the holes in the crackers, for God's sake. Do that. They'll go through the holes and you can project the image of the sun, or suns actually, because there are many holes, onto a separate sheet of white paper or cardboard. So how'd you like that? You didn't know that you could use a cracker to watch a solar eclipse, right? Here's a young lady. She's using a mirror. She's letting the sunlight bounce off a mirror, and don't look at the reflection of the sunlight in the mirror, but it comes down, hits the mirror, bounces off the mirror, and then shines onto a distant screen 30, 40, 50 feet away, and you get another nice view of the eclipse using just a mirror. Another way to watch it. Now, the way that everybody is doing nowadays are the eclipse glasses, which I believe your library is handing out free for those of you patrons of your library. You can just show them, I think, the library card to prove that you're a patron, and you'll get eclipse safety glasses. What are these glasses? What's the difference between these glasses and sunglasses? I have people coming up to me and they say, well, I've got a really dark pair of sunglasses, Joe. I plan to use that for the eclipse. No, don't do that. Oh, sure, the sunglasses you may have may darken the sun sufficiently so that you see it as a disc in your sunglasses, but you know what's happening? Your eyes are being burned without your being aware of it. Your eyes do not have sensors to detect pain, and the sun, along with the visible light, is also emitting ultraviolet and infrared light. The ultraviolet gives you a sunburn after 15 or 20 minutes. The infrared interacts with the blacktop on your driveway or on paved surfaces to help melt the snow. Those infrared and ultraviolet rays, the invisible burning rays of the sun, would be coming onto your retina, straight on through that sunglass and burning your eyes. After the eclipse is over, maybe not immediately, but you might notice later in the day or a couple of days later, there's a black spot. And that was the part of your eye, the part of your retina that was burned by those invisible rays. Don't use sunglasses. These special glasses are made of a special plastic called polymer, which not only reduce the visible light, but also knock out the ultraviolet and infrared rays and allow you to look safely at the partial phases of the eclipse. Linus, in a Peanuts story arc during a solar eclipse many, many years ago, Charles Schultz, when he drew the Peanuts characters talking about looking at the eclipse, Linus is the voice of reason in Peanuts, and he's telling Charlie Brown, sunglasses, smoke glass, photographic negatives. You remember photographic negatives, right? You remember cameras, right? You can't get that anymore. But anyway, they use that to look at eclipses. Don't do that. Welder's glass aren't safe for directly. Well, actually, yes and no. You could use welder's glass, but you got to get the right shade. Welder's goggles come in various shades. The shade that you would want to get if you go to a hardware store or welding supply store is the shade or welder safety plate number 13. That is the correct welder's glass to use. Now, if you get shade 14 or 15, you'll barely be able to make out the sun through those because the shade is a little bit too dense and too thick. If you get something less than 13, if you get like a shade 10 or 8 or 7, that's not good. That's too bright. That'll allow too much light both in sun and also of the ultraviolet infrared rays to get through. So the way Linus was right. You don't use welder's glass if you use the wrong shade. But if you have a shade of welder's glass number 13, that's the number you should be asking for. Shade 13, that is the Goldilocks shade. That will allow you to look safely at the sun. And I made the font green because here's something interesting. The shade of the sun through welder's glass makes the sun look a greenish color. Imagine looking at a green sun going into eclipse. Here's what really got me very upset. I felt like writing Charles Schultz. I didn't, but I should have. He said, Linus is telling Schroeder and Lucy, there's no safe method for looking directly at an eclipse, and it's especially dangerous when it's a total eclipse. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Because when the sun is in total eclipse, and only when the sun is in total eclipse, when all of the sun is covered by the moon, that is when you can remove the glasses, throw away the projection box, look directly up at the sun. That is the only time that you can look directly at the sun is during a total eclipse. When the sun is in totality, look with your eyes, look with binoculars. Take that telescope and train it up toward the sun because you'll be able to see all sorts of wonderful things in that telescope. The corona, the prominences, the flares coming out from behind the sun, those reddish hydrogen alpha flares. That is the time to look directly at the sun during what Linus was saying was the danger period. The most dangerous time is actually the safest time to look. Not in New York City. We will not see a total eclipse. But again, Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester, Niagara Falls, Cleveland, Erie, Pennsylvania, all of those places get totality. All of those places you'll have a chance for 2 or 3 or even 4 minutes when the sun is in total eclipse to look directly at it. And by all means, don't listen to Charlie Brown. This is why Charlie Brown doesn't have any friends. He comes up with this bit of philosophy. He tells Linus, how would your ophthalmologist feel if I just closed my curtains and stayed in bed all day? Don't do that, please. This is really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for you to enjoy a celestial spectacle, a total solar eclipse, upstate New York or northwestern Pennsylvania. And if you don't go to totality, at the very least, use your glasses and enjoy the view of the crescent sun in the sky. Let's all congregate outside the Super Bowl in the parking lot and see that wonderful sight again on Monday of next week. I'm closing this discussion with 3 quotes. 3 quotes. One from the 19th, one from the 20th, and one from the 21st century. The first quote is from the 19th century. You're looking at a picture of a very reputable and well-known British astronomer, and after he experienced totality for the first time in his life in 1851, the British astronomer Edwin Duncan spoke for most of us who have seen a total eclipse when he declared, "Few can imagine how much I long for another minute, for what I had just witnessed seemed very much like a dream." And then in the 20th century, the late Leif Robinson. I knew Leif, he was a good friend, former editor-in-chief of Sky and Telescope magazine from 1980 to 2000, Leif stated it more simply and more succinctly. No one should pass through life without seeing at least once in their life a total solar eclipse. The last quote, the 21st century quote, is from one of my oldest and dearest friends, Glenn Schneider. Glenn and I grew up together in the Bronx, and we've known each other now for over 50 years. People say, "Oh, Joe, how many eclipses have you?" I've seen 13. I've traveled to 13 total eclipses. Glenn laughs at that. Glenn says, "Joe, you're just a piker." Glenn, back in 1972, when I first met him, he said, "I'm seeing every total eclipse of the sun that occurs everywhere on the surface of the earth for the rest of my life." And lo and behold, he has done just that. He has seen 35 total eclipses. He's in the Guinness Book of World Records of having seen more eclipses than anybody else on this planet. And he certainly has the philosophy of eclipses. He writes, if you want to experience the ultimate in human emotion, curiosity, and imagination, then see a total eclipse of the sun. Even if you're poor, starving, in hoc, in trouble with the law, unbalanced, and totally addicted, see it anyway. It's worth it. And believe me, it is absolutely worth it. Hopefully you'll get your chance to see it next week. Let's hope for clear weather, for goodness sake. And I want to thank you all for listening to me blither on for about an hour and 15 minutes. I thank you very, very much. So good luck, and especially keep your fingers crossed. Let's hope for clear skies. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, now's the time to answer them. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. That was really great. There was one question in the chat, which I think you wound up answering, is here, even in New Jersey, if it's the partial eclipse, you absolutely do need to get those glasses on, to get the eclipse glasses. It's not safe, even though we would be only at what, 91% or so, right?
You wouldn't believe how bright that last 9% is. Again, it will get darker to a degree, but still with 9% of the sun, you still cannot look up at the sun because it still appears to the eye blindingly bright.
And I do want to let people know, again, I'm with the Upper Saddle River Library. For Upper Saddle River Library card holders, while supplies last, if you check out two books in our science programs, which are listed, we do have, each family can get up to 2 glasses. We have some available while supplies last. So if you go into the library and check some books out, you can get some of that. So let me check at the check again. Yes, everybody
Somebody
loved
asked about their dogs. Well, if they're going into totality, will the dogs need to have their eyesight protected? Well, I mean, how many dogs actually physically, aside from when they're doing their thing outside, physically stop and stare up at the sun for a long period of time? The dogs are smart. They know that they're not for. But I will tell you this: not all dogs, but maybe some dogs. If you're in the zone of totality and it suddenly gets dark, nature often takes note of that. I've seen situations where birds have gone to roost. They've quieted down during a phase of totality. Animals certainly will take note of it. I've heard roosters, they supposedly crow when the sun reemerges and comes back out. Flowers apparently close during the dark phase of the eclipse. So if you're a nature buff, not only can you look around and watch and see the sky growing dark and the eclipse, but maybe if you have a chance for a few moments, take a look and see what nature is doing. I know that in the summertime, probably not in April, but in the summertime at some total eclipse, you can hear nighttime insects like crickets or katydids beginning to chirp as the sky is darkening because they're fooled. They think it's nighttime. So there you go. It's really an amazing sight, and you really, really are going to be amazed. The first words out of your mouth when you see a total eclipse of the sun, the first words that you're going to say is, "Oh my God, I've got to see another one of these. I've got to. I've got to go wherever it's going to be visible." And again, after this eclipse, your next chance of seeing a total eclipse will be in August of 2026 in Greenland. That's a nice place to take the wife and kids, right? Greenland, Iceland, or here's a nice place, Spain or Portugal. The eclipse path will pass over those countries. But you see, you're going to have to buy a plane ticket or a boat ticket and go all the way out there and take a lot of time to get out there. I mean, here it is, folks. It's being presented to you next Monday. The sun, moon, and the earth, the sun and the moon are going to do their thing, and they're knocking at your side door. Open the door, and if you can't get a chance, people always say, "Oh, I wish I had a good excuse not to go in on a Monday. Man, I don't want to go to work." There's your excuse to see the chance of a lifetime to see a total eclipse of the sun. And I will tell you this right now. A lot of people were planning to go to Texas and Arkansas and Oklahoma and Missouri because according to the long-range weather forecast or the long-term climatology, they said that would be the place that would have the best chances of seeing clear skies. Guess what? According to the latest weather forecast, that part of the eclipse path may be very cloudy. And the worst place you wanted to be would be upstate New York or New England or Atlantic Canada. Oh my goodness. Early April, it's always cloudy most of the time, 80% cloud cover. Horrible, horrible weather. Stay away from it. Well, guess what? The latest forecast for New England and for Atlantic Canada and for upstate New York is for generally clear skies. So you will have the weather on your side as well if you want to try and see the eclipse. Head north. One thing though, is a big storm coming this week, later this week. It'll mean rain and wind for New Jersey and for most of New York, but upstate New York and New England, they're expecting about 1 to 2 feet of snow. I don't know if the snow is going to be cleared away by Monday of next week, but that's just something that you want to keep your eye on if that is
How
going
you
to
doing, sir? Anything I can do for you?
Yep, I called earlier about the eclipse glasses.
Yep.
What do you need, my library card?
Somebody's writing how long.
There you go. Yeah.
There it is. 4 people in my house.
We called you two perhaps all day. Yeah. There you go.
Eclipse will last in New
Thanks so
England and upstate New York about 3 minutes in total eclipse. So there you go. I think I answered most of the questions. I thank you very much again, and good luck to all, and I hope you get a chance to see this wonderful event next week.
Well, thank you very much again, Joe. And
Thank you.
again, for anybody that was here and for the White Cloth patrons as well, I will be sending out a recording of this, so we can go back and go through everything that you said and remember the different hints you were saying of how we should protect our eyes during it. And I think half of us now want to get in the car and go and
Okay.
go watch it. You've convinced a lot of us. So
Very
thank you
good.
very
And